Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest this week is Ben Geffen. He's an attorney with the Public Interest Law Center here in Philadelphia. And his organization has brought what could be the most important partisan gerrymandering case in U.S. history and has led the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to redraw the congressional district lines in Pennsylvania. So it's a fascinating conversation about what's involved in this, what evidence they looked at, and what the implications are for redrawing Pennsylvania's map. You know, Pennsylvania is always a battleground state in national elections, and in the upcoming 2018 midterm elections, this could have a huge impact on the shape of Congress in Washington. So it's a really important case, great conversation. Stay tuned and please enjoy the episode. My guest today is Ben Geffen, an attorney with the Public Interest Law Center here in Philadelphia. Ben, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
We are going to be talking today about a decision from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court from earlier this year that may be one of the most far-reaching Pennsylvania Supreme Court cases in a very, very long time, and probably one that far too many people don't understand, maybe even know about. So we're going to get into the subject of redistricting and gerrymandering today and what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did back in January and the implications of that. So first of all, Ben, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to the Public Interest Law Center.
Sure. So I've been an attorney for 7.5 years at the Public Interest Law Center, which is a nonprofit here in Philadelphia. And we work on civil rights issues in a number of areas: voting, employment, and healthcare, education, housing, and environmental health. And we're a small office. I think we're at 7 lawyers right now. As I said, I've been there 7.5 years. Came here straight out of a clerkship. Before that was a student at NYU Law.
Fantastic. And are you originally from Philadelphia, or you come from New York?
I'm from Oklahoma.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I've been on the East Coast a while, and I married a Jersey girl. And so we've been here ever since 2010.
I don't hear any Okie in your accent whatsoever.
It took a while to get to that point, but thank you.
All right. So now I know that voting rights as a civil rights issue is part of what your group does. And before we get into the current controversy and this big case that you've been working on intensively for the last several months, I know there's another big issue involving voting rights that you were involved in a few years ago, and I think that's a good lead-in to the subject of redistricting and the importance of this case now. So tell us a little bit about the voter ID case that you were involved in before.
Sure. So back in 2012, Pennsylvania passed a voter ID law that would have been the most restrictive in the country. It would have kept people from voting in numbers that were debated, but were anywhere from 60 to 70,000 people to way up to 800, 900, potentially a million people, 800, 900,000. And we challenged that law along with the law firm Arnold and Porter, the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and one other civil rights organization. And the theory of that lawsuit was that the voter ID law, by disenfranchising these voters, violated the Pennsylvania Constitution. A few years earlier, Indiana had passed a somewhat similar law, and people had challenged it in federal court. It went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the plaintiffs lost in that case. We looked to the Pennsylvania state courts for relief because our state constitution contains stronger protections for voting rights than are found in the U.S. Constitution.
And that's a really interesting distinction of the voter ID case history in Pennsylvania. And I know that that's going to set us up for talking about how the gerrymandering case has been handled differently as well. But also take us back to the voting rights case and the premise for the voter ID law, because I know that continues to be an issue that we hear about here and there. This claim that there's a need to deal with the problem of voter fraud.
Sure. And so there's an interesting theme, actually, that unites that case with the gerrymandering case, and it's the integrity of elections. There was a claim that the voter ID law was motivated by a need to protect the integrity of our elections. And the underlying idea here was that there were large numbers of imposters showing up at the polling places, claiming to be someone they weren't, and casting an illegal ballot. It turns out there's no evidence of this, none. And the reason there's no evidence for it is that if it happens extraordinarily rarely. We're talking 1 in a million votes or less. On the other hand, the numbers of voters who would have been forbidden to vote in every election, as I said, was in the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands. So, the balance there was weighing a supposed risk of maybe 1 in a million fraudulent votes against the risk of disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvania citizens.
And the idea was that people would have to present an ID in order to vote, or get a certain kind of ID,
right,
and present it at the voting booth in order to vote. Why was that seen as such a problem for so many people that you would say it would actually disenfranchise them?
So I think for most of us, for me certainly, before I did this case, I thought, everybody has an ID. It's not hard to get an ID. You just go to the driver's license office and you get an ID. It turns out for large segments of the population, it's not that easy. So for example, this was a particularly common problem in Philadelphia for older African-American voters. And in Philadelphia, like many northern cities, there was a great migration in the earlier part of the 20th century of African Americans from the southern states to the northern cities. And Black people born in the Jim Crow South typically were not issued a birth certificate. And if you don't have a birth certificate, it's very difficult to get a photo ID that would comply with a law like Pennsylvania's law. And that's particularly true for people who've lived in a city and relied on public transportation for their whole adult lives. It became much harder after 9/11 to get a photo ID at all. And so if you weren't already holding one since before then, and suddenly you were told you won't be allowed to vote anymore unless you can come up with a photo ID, it became a very difficult obstacle. So for example, one of the witnesses who testified in our case was from Puerto Rico. So she's, of course, an American citizen by birth, born in Puerto Rico, part of this country, but has lived in Philadelphia for her whole adult life. It was impossible for her to obtain a birth certificate from Puerto Rico over the mail. She was told that if you want to get a photo ID, you have to come in person to apply. Of course, she didn't have a lot of spare cash lying around to buy a plane ticket to Puerto Rico. And even if she'd bought one, she'd have had a problem when she got to the airport, which is that she didn't have a photo ID. So there were all sorts of predicaments that were encountered by, as I said, tens or hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvania voters that would have made it impossible for them to vote.
Now, of course, the right to vote is a core right for every American citizen, but we also have had a history in this country of efforts to limit access to the voting booth for certain groups. In the South, blacks prevented from voting what was a big issue, and that's why the voting rights efforts was a central part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. Here, when you pass a law in Pennsylvania demanding an ID, and you're describing some of the individual stories that illustrate why this was a problem, what I'm hearing is, and what I remember reading about as this was unfolding several years ago, is that there is a disparate impact on certain segments of our population, and this would disproportionately impact lower income people, racial minorities, those who have immigrated from some other country, or not from another country, but say a place like Puerto Rico. Was it part of the challenge to the Pennsylvania voter ID law that there was some intent to disenfranchise certain segments of the population?
So proof of intent is challenging when you're dealing with legislation. However, in the case of the voter ID law, the proof was made somewhat easier by a member of the Pennsylvania House named Mike Turzai. At the time, I believe he was the majority leader, and now he's the Speaker of the House. And he was caught on video bragging that the law had been passed to help Governor Romney win the state of Pennsylvania. Sometimes you get.
And how did that work?
So this was this law was passed in March, I believe, of 2012, when the presidential election was heating up, and I think there was an assumption, and I think it was correct, that voters who lacked an ID or who would have difficulty obtaining one tended to vote for Democrats. And if I can segue into the gerrymandering a bit here, proof of intent is also an issue when you're trying to prove an unconstitutional gerrymander. In North Carolina, there was an incident somewhat like the Mike Turzai incident with the Pennsylvania voter ID law. North Carolina also has a highly irregular congressional districting plan, and it's being challenged in court right now. And one of the architects of that plan was a state legislative leader who said, and I may not get the quote verbatim, but something to the effect of, I'm often asked why we passed a map that has 10 Republican seats and 3 Democratic seats. The reason is we couldn't figure out how to make it 11-2. So sometimes you get a smoking gun of intent like that. Or sometimes you have to be a little more creative.
But I asked the question about the voting right, or the voter ID law rather, for a reason, because I know that we're going to be talking about the partisan nature of gerrymandering by definition, and how it played into overturning the district map that was created by a Republican-controlled state legislature in Pennsylvania by the Supreme Court. And I think there's some precedent for it, not necessarily a direct precedent, but in some of the themes and some of the ideas in this voter ID law, which I think, from what you're describing, clearly has a partisan nature to it. We're passing this voter ID law to keep Democrats from voting, or certain voters who tend to vote Democrats from voting. And the outcome in that case, of course, was that the Supreme Court struck down that voter ID law, right?
So Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued a decision in our favor, remanding the case actually to Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, which was the trial court. And the Commonwealth Court ultimately did issue a permanent injunction that's kept that law ever from taking effect.
Okay. So let's segue then into the current controversy involving redistricting, and I know that some of these terms can be confusing too. So let's at the outset understand what we're really dealing with here. And first of all, we need to understand redistricting in order to get to the whole idea of gerrymandering. So help us understand what redistricting is.
Sure. So the U.S. House of Representatives has 435 seats. Every 10 years, we take a census in this country, and the Congress is reapportioned, which means that each state's number of representatives to the House goes up or down to account for shifts in their relative population size. Pennsylvania tends to lose seats. We had twice as many seats 100 years ago as we now have. Our population growth has been anemic compared to that of some other states. So we're down to 18 seats in Congress now. After the 2020 census, we're likely to go down further. So every decade, Pennsylvania loses a seat or two and has to redraw its congressional districts to ensure that each of them has the same population.
And there could be changes in population within the state too, right?
Absolutely.
That could impact the district lines.
Sure. So the population in Pennsylvania the growth has been happening more on the eastern side of the state than the western side of the state, and so the new maps have to take account of that as well.
Okay. So how does that actually happen? What's the mechanism once the census numbers are digested and you know where the shifts are? What's the actual process for redistricting?
Sure. So it happens differently in different states. Some states use a commission. Some states use a special body created by the legislature or the courts. In Pennsylvania, it's passed as simple legislation. So a bill passed in the House and the Senate, signed by the governor or not, and it's enacted just like any other old law. And the timing of it is that the census results become available in the middle of the 0 year. So mid 2010, they became available. And the new maps needed to be in place in time for the 2012 primary elections.
Okay.
So that was the window of time that was available.
So what happens in Pennsylvania in 2010 and leading into 2011 that leads to an awareness of a problem that then in turn leads to the filing of a challenge?
Sure. So in 2010, the census numbers became available. Nothing happened in the legislature for a while. In November 2010, Pennsylvania elected a Republican majority to the state legislature, both houses, and also elected a Republican, Tom Corbett, as governor, replacing Ed Rendell, who'd been the Democratic governor for 8
So
years.
the Republicans took over completely both houses of the state legislature and the governors.
That's right. And I want to emphasize one thing, Aaron, which is that I'm from a nonpartisan organization, and our challenge here is nonpartisan. In 2010, it so happens that in Pennsylvania, the Republicans controlled this process. I don't want to leave the impression that this is just a Republican problem.
That's a great point, yeah.
In Maryland, for example, the Democrats controlled the governor's office and the state legislature after the 2010 election. And it probably won't come as a surprise that they gerrymandered the heck out of their state to favor Democrats. And we don't like that one bit more than we like gerrymandering by Republicans. So just want to emphasize, even though I'm going to be talking about what Republicans did to Pennsylvania, this is a bipartisan problem.
Well, we haven't even, and that's an absolutely excellent point. And, I'm still trying to understand redistricting, which is a routine process that has to take place after the census whenever the population shifts, and it affects either the number of districts in a particular state or where those districts need to be, how those districts need to be identified given population shifts. Then we get to the whole subject of what gerrymandering is. And you're right, whoever is in control, and it may be that no party is in full control, it may be a bipartisan issue in a particular census year that where you have to go through the process of redistricting. But when redistricting crosses over into gerrymandering, or what some would argue is gerrymandering, is really the issue here. So what occurred in Pennsylvania, and we can also talk about Maryland, so that we're not seen as just focusing on something Republicans did as they did here in Pennsylvania, but because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court case is going to have, I think is likely to have such far-reaching consequences, and it's going to reverberate loudly in this country. Tell us what happened in Pennsylvania that led your organization and others too to say this isn't just redistricting. This is looking like gerrymandering.
Sure. So the state of Pennsylvania, as I said, has 18 seats in Congress. And for those of your listeners who aren't in Pennsylvania, I would emphasize that Pennsylvania is a very hotly contested state between Republicans and Democrats in statewide elections. So in 2016, President Trump defeated Secretary Clinton in Pennsylvania. In 2014, Tom Wolf, a Democrat, won the gubernatorial election by a big margin. In 2012, President Obama beat Governor Romney in Pennsylvania. We've had close Senate races for many years in this state as well. So it's a state that's very tightly divided between Democrats and Republicans. So you might expect, okay, if we've got 18 seats in Congress, you'd expect it to be about a 9-9 division between D's and R's, maybe 10-8 or 8-10. That's not what happens in Pennsylvania. And the reason it doesn't happen is the map was drawn in such a way to lock in a 13-5 Republican advantage. So even in years when the Republicans statewide get under half of the votes for U.S. House candidates, they always get 13 congressional districts, 72% of the seats, even when they're getting 48% of the votes.
Well, the other interesting thing about Pennsylvania, when you look at it, and I'll note that, Ben, you and I are looking at color maps of the congressional districts as the lines existed after the Republican-controlled legislature and the governor passed redistricting in 2011, and how the Supreme Court has redrawn those lines in the last few weeks. And we'll post links to those so people can see them for themselves as well. But one of the interesting things about Pennsylvania, which is a phenomenon happening in many states, and in many states where redistricting is being challenged, is we see urban centers tending to be places where Democratic votes are concentrated relative to rural parts of states. And so in Pennsylvania, we have on in the southeastern corner of the state, we have Philadelphia and the counties surrounding Philadelphia, tending in current times to be leaning Democratic in terms of their votes, if not heavily Democratic in the city of Philadelphia. And at the other end of the state, you have Pittsburgh, also tending to lean Democratic. And then you've got this vast middle part of the state that's very rural. So how does the legislature, once Republicans take control and control the process of redistricting, how do they, as you say, lock in a 13-5 advantage given the dynamic of population within the state of Pennsylvania?
Sure. So often people ask about this issue of the great sort, this movement of Democrats and Republicans into enclaves where they self-cluster. Mm-hmm. And can that explain things like this 13-5 split? And I won't delve into the deep mathematics unless we absolutely have to, but a number of political scientists and statisticians have looked at that issue as it applies to Pennsylvania or to states around the country, and have found that it probably can explain a little bit of what you might call a natural Republican advantage in the political geography of a state, but it's a very modest effect, and it can't get anywhere close to explaining something like a 13-5 split. But the basic idea of how you would gerrymander a state, if you were so inclined, is that you pack and crack. Those are the terms people use. So you, if you are the in party and you want to disadvantage the out party, you pack as many of the out party voters as you can into a small number of districts, and then you crack the rest of them across a bigger number. So in Pennsylvania, the way that played out is you would get a district like, and I'm using the numbers here for the congressional districts from the 2011 map. The second congressional district, where we're sitting right now in Philadelphia, where the district's population is something like 90% Democrats. That's one of the most packed districts in the country. And then if you look at a Republican-leaning district in the old map, you'll see districts like the 16th district or the 6th district, where Republicans have an advantage of something like 55-45 or 58-42. So they have a much smaller but still comfortable advantage in the number of voters. But the advantage is small enough that they can spread the good luck, as you might call it, across a much bigger number of districts.
Right. Well, okay. So packing is many Democratic or Republican voters into one district, so that those voters aren't spread out across the lines of multiple districts. And that way, in this case, if you're Republicans trying to disadvantage Democrats, you're going to limit the number of seats Democrats can control out of the 18 total seats available by packing them into just a few congressional districts. How does cracking come into play then?
So cracking spreads the Democrats in Pennsylvania across a bigger number of districts, so that they can't ever get enough votes together to actually win a race. And I'd emphasize also that this has an effect beyond just naked partisan advantage in the U.S. House. It also contributes to partisan polarization. And the reason it does that is there aren't there aren't competitive districts when you do this. Every seat becomes a safe seat. And when you have a safe seat, the second district is a safe seat for the Democrats, the 16th district a safe seat for the Republicans. That means that the general election is a foregone conclusion. There's no surprise about who's going to win that race. As a result, the real fight is in the primary. And primaries tend to attract the most hardcore supporters of a political party, and they tend to be voters on the Democratic side who are more left-leaning than the average Democrat, and on the Republican side more right-leaning than the average Republican. So you end up creating this mechanism that picks the most left-wing Democrats in the primaries and the most right-wing Republicans, and then plops them down into non-competitive general elections. So there's a lot of evidence that this contributes to the disappearance of moderates from both parties from the U.S. House, and contributes to the polarization and the immobility of legislation in the U.S. House.
Well, and also you mentioned, cementing in place these safe seats, making them even more safe. There's already an advantage of incumbency, we know, in running for Congress. If you hold the seat, you've got you've done favors for people. You've got a reputation. It's just harder and harder to challenge an incumbent. So, if you're creating more and more safety in these seats, then I imagine you're also making it more likely that an incumbent's going to be elected. You're going to have less turnover in the House.
That may be true, and we've certainly seen in some of the districts in Pennsylvania that the incumbent doesn't leave office unless it's in handcuffs or a casket.
Right. So, okay, so cracking is in this case the way Republicans redrew the map in 2011 is to spread out Democratic voters. How can you give us an example or two of how they actually did that?
If you listeners, if you open up a map on your computer screen or your phone screen, you can look at some of the wacky shapes of Pennsylvania's districts. The most famous is the 7th district from the 2011 map. And the 7th district begins in the western suburbs of Philadelphia and then stretches far west all the way out to the Amish part of the state. And it's a district with a tortured shape. It's been nicknamed Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. And it consists of several highly discrete areas that are connected only by narrow isthmuses, narrow land bridges. When we filed this case, we zoomed in on Google Maps on some of those little land bridges to see what they were. One of them is the parking lot of Creed Seafood and Steaks, a restaurant in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. Another is a medical center in Brandywine, Pennsylvania. So these are places that don't actually even have any residents and are just artifacts of an effort to artificially lump together parts of the state that don't really have anything in common.
So, and I imagine another consequence of all this too is I'm imagining what it must be like if you are the representative from that district. You have people who are your constituents who may be very far apart geographically, who may be very different in terms of their lifestyle given the part of the state they live in. And I mean that must present some challenges for representation even after an election's taken place.
Absolutely. There are some of these large districts you can't even get from one part of the district to another without spending a lot of time driving through a different district from your own. That makes it harder for a challenger to dislodge an incumbent because it just becomes very costly in money and time to traverse the district. And it also affects the voters and the communities that they're in. So, for example, Montgomery County, which is the 3rd biggest county in Pennsylvania, it's a suburban Philadelphia county, has something like 800,000 residents, and you need 705,000 residents per congressional district in Pennsylvania. So they have enough people to have their own congressional seat plus a little more. Under the 2011 map, Montgomery County was split across 5 different congressional districts, and not one of those congressmen lived in Montgomery County. Each of those congressmen represented, and I say congressmen, they were all men. Pennsylvania has a entirely male congressional delegation, and whether that's a consequence of redistricting, I'll leave as a thought experiment for your listeners. But the Montgomery County congressmen all primarily represented some county other than Montgomery County. So Montgomery County was a relatively low priority for each of these guys. And I've heard elected officials from Montgomery County talk about how difficult it was to get a member of Congress to champion a local issue in their community because Montgomery County just wasn't that important to any of them.
Right. So that would be an example of cracking then, right? Montgomery County was cracked. Its population was split between those 5 different districts.
Right.
Wow. Okay. So since redistricting happens every 10 years and both Democrats in control of a state legislature and Republicans in control of a state legislature are going to look for ways to advantage their own party when it comes to redistricting. How do we know, or how do courts evaluate challenges to those redistricting maps to know whether that those redrawing of that redrawing of lines constitutes something that's unconstitutional?
Sure.
I mean, that's really the big
Right.
the big issue here.
It is a big issue, and our case proceeded by showing both that the drawing the lines here was motivated by partisan intent and that it accomplished the desired effect. That is to say, the map was deliberately drawn for partisan advantage, and it accomplished that. So there were a number of different ways that we could show intent. We didn't have quite the same smoking gun they had in North Carolina that I earlier mentioned, the state legislative leader bragging about his partisan achievement.
He is the same.
So yes,
Michael
here we do
Turzai in this case.
Michael Turzai, the Speaker of the House in Pennsylvania, is a defendant in our lawsuit in Pennsylvania. Maybe learned his lesson after the voter ID case and wasn't quite as brazen in his public boasts this time around. Nonetheless, we had a number of ways that we could show intent. And those include the legislative process, the shapes of the districts, and statistical evidence. And I'll just briefly mention each of those. The legislation passed in 2011 it began in September of 2011. A bill was introduced in the Senate of Pennsylvania that said the first congressional district shall consist of a portion of the Commonwealth. The second congressional district shall consist of a portion of the Commonwealth, and so on, 18 times. That's all the bill said. It was introduced in the Senate. It was given a first reading, a second reading, and so on. It passed out of committee, all that good stuff. And only on December 14th, 2011, in the early morning, was the bill amended to include its actual substance, to actually include descriptions of each of the 18 districts. And it passed 14 hours later. It passed that same night. Nobody except a small coterie of Republican legislators and staffers was allowed to see the description of the districts in advance. And so it hit the floor of the Senate in the morning and was passed that night. It was rammed through the House in a matter of just a few days and signed by the governor. So it was a process that happened entirely behind closed doors and was controlled entirely by one party. Shapes, we've already talked about Goofy kicking Donald Duck and some of these other wild shapes. And it's not just that the shapes look strange, and they do look strange, but it's also that they fracture communities. They split up counties, they split up municipalities, they split up communities of interest in ways that are unprecedented in Pennsylvania. Just to give another example, if readers look at the 2011 map, way in the far northwest corner of Pennsylvania on Lake Erie is the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, which is a Democratic stronghold and an otherwise largely Republican part of the state. Erie had always, the city of Erie and the county of Erie had always, in the history of Pennsylvania, been included in a single congressional district. But the 2011 plan split Erie County right through the middle and contorted itself to divide that part of the state across two districts to ensure that each of them would have a safe Republican seat. So the shapes provided additional evidence. And finally, there's this statistical evidence. We could spend all day talking about Markov chains and the mean median gap and so on. But rather than do that, let me just say that we had a couple of expert witnesses who testified at trial who used computer simulations and advanced statistical techniques to show that no explanation other than partisan intent could explain how this map came to look the way it does.
Well, Ben, you provided me with a copy of the initial or the opening brief in the challenge to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and there's actually it's a fairly thick read, but if anybody is interested in reading more about what the statistical evidence was, and it's fascinating, looking at the social science statistical work that was done in this case. We can post a link to this too, and then people can download this and read about it.
That's great. And I'll also send you, if it's all right, a link to a recent article from Wired magazine that profiled each of the 4 expert witnesses who testified in our case and gave a nice readable summary of their methodologies.
That would be great. Yeah, we can post a link to that as well, because I think it is too much to get into it. But it leads me to this question, which is this is a challenge to redistricting that I think is going to set precedent, but it's not unprecedented in that this isn't the first time redistricting has ever been challenged. It may be the first time that a state Supreme Court. Well, you tell me, is this the first time that a state Supreme Court has overturned a redistricting map?
So no, it's not. But it is the first time that it's done something that I'll mention in a second. So redistricting litigation goes back many decades. Famously, in the early part of the 20th century, the U.S. Supreme Court repeatedly refused to step in to challenge violations of this one person, one vote notion, this idea that every district should have an equal population, so the voters in one district don't have more power than the voters in a different district. And finally, in the early 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court said enough is enough. This has gone too far. The deviations in district size have become too extreme. And the U.S. Supreme Court established as a matter of federal constitutional law that districts had to have equal populations. Redistricting has also been challenged in courts, in both federal and state courts, on racial grounds. That on the one hand, that the Voting Rights Act requires the creation of what are known as minority majority districts or minority opportunity districts to ensure that there are some districts where racial ethnic minority groups have an opportunity to elect a candidate who represents their group. In addition, some states have gone too far and have packed racial groups into districts. And when this goes too far, it can violate the federal constitution as well. So there have been all sorts of challenges around those lines. Partisan gerrymandering, though, the kind of redistricting malfeasance that we're talking about here, is at the cutting edge of how these cases are litigated. Several previous challenges in the U.S. Supreme Court under the U.S. Constitution have resulted in unclear or fractured decisions. Nobody has ever successfully challenged one of these plans in the U.S. Supreme Court. But at the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court has never said that door is slammed shut, that you can't ever challenge a case like that in federal court. And there are a couple of cases pending this spring in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. One out of Wisconsin about state legislative districts there, one out of Maryland, where, as I said, the Democrats gerrymandered the congressional seats, that may bring some nationwide clarity to this issue. But our case is the first one in a state Supreme Court, with the exception of a few states like Florida that have explicit language in their state constitution forbidding the consideration of partisanship when drawing maps. Ours is the first one in a state Supreme Court that lacks such a provision in its state constitution that struck down a map as a partisan gerrymander.
So that's what I was trying to understand, because as I understand, the prior attempts to challenge partisan gerrymandering, where one political party is trying to gain an advantage in redistricting over the other party, what the U.S. Supreme Court has said in prior cases, and I'm very, very much paraphrasing and boiling down here, how do we know when it is partisan gerrymandering? Is there some metric? Is there some measure that you, challenger, can present to us so that we're not engaging in what some would accuse us as being partisan ourselves? How can we look at this in some objective way? And I think that's what the challenge to the Wisconsin redistricting that's currently before the U.S. Supreme Court, that's what they're trying to establish in that case, isn't it? That there should be, as you say, some national standard.
Sure. So the last time the U.S. Supreme Court considered this issue was also a case out of Pennsylvania. And that was in 2004. The case was Veith versus Jubileer. Pennsylvania's post-2000 census map for congressional districts was challenged on partisan gerrymandering grounds in federal court. And it resulted in a fractured decision. The four most conservative justices would have said, you can't bring a case like this in federal court. The four more liberal-leaning justices would have ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The swing vote, as is so often the case, came from Justice Kennedy. And he joined the more conservative justices in ruling against the plaintiffs, but he didn't say that you could never bring such a case. He said that the plaintiffs in this case have failed to present the court with a judicially manageable standard. Ever since 2004, there's been a quest for the Holy Grail. What is this judicially manageable standard? Some people have looked at it as a quest for some statistical measure, some mathematical way of looking at redistricting that will separate the sheep from the goats. That's not how we looked at it. We think of the judicially manageable standard as something like what I explained earlier. Proving intent, proving effect, the burden then shifting to the defendants, for example, to prove that there's no neutral justification for the districts. So these are familiar types of legal tests that are used in all sorts of contexts, like employment discrimination.
Other civil rights type of cases.
Right.
Yeah.
And the statistical measures are evidence of intent, they're evidence of effect, but they themselves are not the standard. There are a variety of statistical tools that could be used, and I'm sure others will be invented in the future. But we're not arguing that one or a collection of those statistical measures is the standard. We're just arguing that those are evidence that can help you make out your proof in a case like this.
And the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, has many times used a framework that you're describing to rule on all kinds of discrimination cases and civil rights violation, as you say, in racial discrimination and gender discrimination cases, they will use a framework like that.
Right.
But we know in this case, in the Pennsylvania case, that you didn't even go in the direction of federal court. You brought the challenge in state court, and not under the U.S. Constitution, but under the Pennsylvania state constitution.
Right.
Why that approach here?
So we'd had good luck with that approach in 2012 and 13 in the voter ID cases I mentioned. Interestingly, the U.S. Constitution does not have an express right to vote. It says things like you can't deny the right to vote because of race or sex or age, but it doesn't actually say you have the right to vote. The Pennsylvania Constitution, like virtually every state constitution, does contain express language protecting the right to vote. And in addition, Pennsylvania Supreme Court has held on a number of occasions that our state constitution's protections for things like the right to vote and freedom of association and freedom of expression exceed the protections of the federal constitution. There was a case in 15 or so years ago called Papps versus City of Erie. In Erie, someone tried to open a strip club. The City of Erie passed an ordinance to block it. The owner of the club challenged it in federal court under the First Amendment. It went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The city won. The ordinance was upheld. The strip club then filed a new lawsuit in state court challenging the law again, and it was a claim brought entirely under the free expression guarantee of Pennsylvania's Constitution. It went up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and the strip club won. And the court held that our free expression guarantees exceed those of the First Amendment. So, in this case, we feel like if the right to topless dancing is enshrined in the Pennsylvania Constitution, surely the right to vote should enjoy protections at least that strong.
Well, and here the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and this brings us to sort of where this is at this point. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was in January of this year, after a lot of evidence, the statistical evidence and the other evidence that was pulled together on both sides was reviewed by the Commonwealth Court, the trial court. Then the Supreme Court steps in and says, we've looked at all this evidence, and we find that the map drawn in 2011 does evidence, I think that we use the word palpable, as if you could touch it, That's how strong the evidence was, according to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, of partisan gerrymandering. And just briefly summarize for us what happened next and where we are now, and why, in a certain sense, the timing of this is so crucial.
So the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania struck down the current map in January, gave the legislature an opportunity to remedy the problem by enacting a new map.
Still controlled by Republicans.
Correct. I would also add that now the governor of Pennsylvania is a Democrat, and so to pass remedial legislation, they would have to reach an agreement with the governor. They failed to do so within the time frame set by the Supreme Court's order, and as a result, the court invited the parties each to submit their own proposed remedial maps, and ultimately, on February 19th, the court issued a final order that drew a new map for our congressional districts according to criteria that it had identified in its order. And the final map, we believe, does a far better job than the 2011 map of redistricting the state. And I think you're going to post a link to it on your website. Even just from looking at it, you see that it doesn't have those crazy shapes anymore. It's a map that looks like Pennsylvania. You can tell where, if you're familiar with the state's political geography, where different communities are, and they're included within single districts.
You don't have Montgomery County split into 5 different
districts.
So,
great example. Montgomery County is now just 2 districts. There's 1 seat. I think it's the fourth district that is an entirely Montgomery County district, and then there's a little bit of the 3rd district, I believe, that is shared, or maybe it's the 2nd district, sorry, that's shared with the city of Philadelphia. So quantitatively, some of the things that are better about the new map, it splits far fewer counties and far fewer municipalities than the old map. So it does a much better job of ensuring that county or city voters and county or city elected officials are represented by a member of Congress who takes that community's interests to heart.
And we have, because we have midterm elections this year in 2018, we have primaries coming up in May, I believe.
May 15th will be the primary in Pennsylvania.
So the map drawn by the Supreme Court is the map that, at least for the moment, those who are looking to run for Congress and run for a seat in one of these districts is using. But the other side is still not very happy with this decision. And so where does the challenge to what the Supreme Court has done now sit, as far as the current posture?
So the litigation in state court is concluded and the order is final. The normal rule in litigation is that if a state Supreme Court issues a decision based entirely on the state constitution, that's it. The game is over. There's no further appeal that can be brought. Nonetheless, our case is currently, this final map has currently been challenged in 2 different federal lawsuits. The defendants in the state court case have sought an emergency stay from the U.S. Supreme Court, and a different group of Republican politicians, represented by the same lawyers, has filed a lawsuit in federal district court in Harrisburg, also seeking for implementation of the order to be stopped. And the legal theories there come from a part of the U.S. Constitution known as the Elections Clause. And the basic argument is that Elections Clause says that redistricting plans shall be drawn by the state legislature. Their argument is that this precludes a court from drawing a map. This is wrong. We believe that there are decades of precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court, from state Supreme Courts around the country, that squarely contradict this decision, this argument. Another argument that they made is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court didn't give sufficient time to the legislature to draw a map. Nonetheless, they failed to articulate any judicially manageable standard that a federal court could use to decide how much time is enough time for a state Supreme Court to give a legislature to remedy its defects.
And from what I've read, redistricted maps with less time between the coming out of with the new map and the primary elections, we function with less time than we've had in this case.
Sure. So a great example of that is the Supreme Court's order gave 18 days to the legislature to pass a new map. The legislature passed it in less time than that in 2011,
right.
When they did this, when they enacted the plan that we challenged in the original instance. And there have been other orders that gave even less time. And so there's no barrier. There was no barrier to the legislature enacting a map in that time frame, but it would have required negotiation by the legislative leaders. It would have required public hearings on the floor of the Senate and the House. It would have required, I assume, some sort of discussions with the governor's office. Apparently, they weren't able or willing to do that, and as a result, they failed to enact a new map in time for the Supreme Court not to draw its own.
So, broadly speaking, when you look at constitutional controversies, one of the things that always comes up, and as practicing lawyers, we confront this all the time. The Constitution doesn't address every imaginable application of the principles in the document itself. It's left to state constitutions. It's left to state law. It's left to courts to interpret and deal with cases as they come along. And so you've mentioned that that redistricting litigation challenges to these congressional maps. There's nothing new in that. As long as there's been state legislatures redrawing maps, there's going to be some party or some interest group that may want to make a challenge to that redrawn map. What is different about this case? What is special about what's happened here in Pennsylvania? And what do you think are the potentially far-ranging implications of it?
Every decade in Pennsylvania and in lots of other states, this problem has gotten worse. And it's gotten worse for a few reasons. One is the availability of more powerful computers and bigger data sets that have made it possible to craft with surgical precision districts that pack and crack for one party's advantage. So technological improvements have made it possible to do this to a more extreme degree every decade. Also, I think there's just been a certain brazenness that's developed in the politician class of people who actually wield the pen or wield the mouse to draw these maps. Because previous court decisions declined to step in, I think people on both sides of the aisle got the idea that if I control this process, I can go as far as I want and no one's going to ever do anything about it. So I think that's part of it as well. And then also our increased political polarization in this country has emboldened people as well. So I think what we've seen here is a court finally saying enough is enough. A court finally saying that that even though the redistricting process inherently involves some subjective elements, that when you go this far with your intent and your effect to benefit one party at the expense of voters, at the expense of keeping communities together, at the expense of making districts compact, and so forth, that violates basic constitutional principles.
But meanwhile, you have this challenge that's pending in the U.S. Supreme Court involving Wisconsin's redistricting, and also a separate case also before the U.S. Supreme Court involving Maryland's redistricting. So how are all these going to come together, do you think? Or is it simply just going to be still, case by case by case? We're going to have to look at what happened to see whether it crossed some line.
I'm hopeful that the U.S. Supreme Court will strike down those maps from Wisconsin and Maryland. I'm hopeful, or will uphold lower court decisions in Wisconsin and also North Carolina, a case that's working its way up to the Supreme Court, striking down maps. And I'm hopeful that they will look to this decision from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court for guidance when they craft their decision, because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did a great job of explaining just how and why this violated the Constitution. And the basic idea was that drawing districts in this way uses partisan considerations to subordinate neutral redistricting criteria like compactness, like intactness of local government units. And when courts spot this subordination of neutral principles, that's when they can find a violation of the Constitution. Interestingly, the Wisconsin and Maryland cases bring completely different legal theories under the U.S. Constitution that point towards similar results. The Wisconsin case challenges the map under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause and says that this map discriminates against one group by diluting its voting strength. And Wisconsin, it's Democrats who are discriminated against. The Maryland case uses the First Amendment and says that when you vote, you are expressing yourself, and that's an activity protected by the First Amendment. When you congregate with other voters in a political party, that's association, which is also protected by the First Amendment. And when the state legislature punishes you for engaging in that constitutionally protected conduct by singling you out for unfavorable treatment, that is a violation of the Constitution.
I like that argument.
So that's the First Amendment theory.
Yeah.
It points to a similar outcome, but it's based on a different notion.
But it seemed, but the First Amendment argument is compared to the equal protection argument in the Wisconsin case seems to me closer to the way of thinking that you all employed in terms of the Pennsylvania constitutional argument, because it's a you can call it freedom to vote, but the voting process here is a kind of association. It's the way people are grouped together.
The lead argument that we advanced in our brief to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was more akin to the Maryland argument.
Yeah.
We argued that the Pennsylvania Constitution's free expression and free association guarantees prohibit this sort of retaliatory map making. That's not the grounds that we won on. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court went with our Plan B argument, which was that the state constitution's free and equal elections clause, which is part of our state constitution's equal protection guarantee, prohibits this discrimination against political groups.
So I guess the lesson is it's always good to have a plan B.
Yes, it is.
Listen, Ben, this has been great. I know I've learned a lot, and this has been a great conversation to understand this really important case and this really important issue. If this map sticks, if the newly drawn map sticks, and there is a shift from 13 to 5 in favor of Republicans to whatever it's going to end up being in the midterm elections, that could have broad implications beyond Pennsylvania to the makeup of the House of Representatives in Washington. So, I know that wasn't the goal because you're nonpartisan, but that may be a very, very important consequence of this. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens.
The far-reaching consequence that I'd like to see from this case would be state courts all around the country using the logic of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to take a good hard look at partisan gerrymandering in other states.
Ben, thanks so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. It's great to have you.
Aaron, thank you.